Hi and welcome! This is the Camille corset top, and in this video I'm going to show you step by step how you can make it yourself. The pattern for the top is available on my Etsy shop, which is linked in the description box below. The pattern is designed to have a shirred back, however I'm also going to show you how you can adjust this to a lace-up back with either eyelets or loops. The first thing you need to do is of course to print out the pattern, making sure you print it at 100% scale or actual size. You then need to assemble the pattern without any gaps between the pattern lines, so for an A4 paper you will need to cut at the dotted line and align the pattern lines to match up. You can then go ahead and either cut or trace the size you want to make. If you are planning on making different sizes at some point, I would recommend to trace it, as it will save you having to print it again. For the Camille corset top you will need about 1 meter for one set of pattern pieces, so if you are using the same fabric for both the lining and the fashion fabric, you'll need between 1.5 to 2 meters of fabric. You will also need a sewing machine, matching thread, an iron, a fabric marker, between 2 to 3 meters of elastic for the shirred back, or about 10 eyelets and some ribbon for the tie-up back. The pattern includes 1 cm seam allowance, so you can go ahead and trace the patterns onto your fabric and then cut it out. Please make sure to cut the front bust piece and front center piece on a fold. You should then be left with 2 front bust pieces, 2 front center pieces, 4 front side pieces, 4 back side pieces, 2 straps, and 2 center back pieces if you are doing the shirred back look. If you are making the lace-up back instead, then you will not need the 2 wide center back pieces, and instead have 4 of these much narrower pieces which you can follow the guide on the pattern for. And in case you do not use eyelets for the lace-up back, then you will also need about 8 or 10 little rectangles like these. You can pretty much use any type of fabric for this top. If however you are using really light fabric like I do for this floral top, then I would definitely recommend to iron some interfacing onto those pieces to give it more stability. The first step for any style of this top is to simply sew the straps. There are lots of different ways straps can be sewn, however I would recommend to simply folding them in half and sew along the entire edge. You should cut off the excess fabric to make it easier to turn them right sides out, and you can then use a loop turner or safety pin to turn them right sides out. The next step is optional, but I would recommend to top stitch the strap down for a nice and crisp look. You can now start with the top, and the first thing to do is to mark the darts onto both front bust pieces. For that I always mark the peak of the dart onto the fabric and then mark the sides of the dart and connect them with the peak. We repeat that same step for the other side, and of course also with the second bust piece. Next you should pin the dart in place, making sure you align both lines with each other and then sew along the dart. Once the darts are in, it is very important to iron the darts at this stage so they are really crisp and lay flat. Moving on to the front pieces, we can now sew the front side seams by sewing the front and side pieces right sides together. Although I'm not showing it here, please also iron those seams down before you continue sewing. To connect the bust piece to the other front pieces, we need to fold both pieces in half and either mark the middle with a marker or place a pin. We do this for both pieces of course, because this way we can make sure to perfectly align both front parts. We then need to align those markings or pins and pin the front pieces together exactly with the middles of both pieces touching. From here we can now pin outwards to the sides, slightly easing the fabric along those curvy lines. I used very many pins for this and would recommend you do this too, as this is making the sewing a little easier and helps keep everything in place. We then of course sew along that edge, which would leave us with this front piece. Like with any curved seam, we need to clip the seam allowance to allow the fabric to lay nice and flat. And like after every step for this top, we again iron the seam flat. This is very important when making this top, so don't skip this part. And whilst I'm not showing it, we of course do each of these steps for both the fashion and the lining fabric. Next, we can attach the side back pieces to the top by again sewing them right sides together, with the longer side being attached to the front pieces. If you are making the lace-up version, you would now also attach the remaining back pieces as well. If you are making the shirred back version, then you can skip to this time on the screen. You'd once again make sure to press all those seams nice and flat. For the shirred back and the lace-up back, the next step is to attach the straps to the top by sandwiching it between the lining and the fashion fabric, making sure the stitching is pointing inwards. We place the lining layer on top and pin all along the top seam. This then needs to be stitched in place, and after that we of course once again clip the seam allowance of the curvy edges. We can then turn the right side out. For the lace-up back, you can already attach the straps to the back at this stage too. I simply seam rip the stitching along the top edge of the center back piece right in the middle. However, you can already place the strap in when attaching the lining to the top. Just make sure the strap is not twisted. Once it's sandwiched between the layer, we can close this gap again and should have straps that are attached to both sides of the top. And of course, we iron the top again. For the shirred back, you can now work on the back pieces. We need to mark the strap notch from the pattern onto the fabric pieces. And then sandwich the other end of the straps between the fashion and lining fabric, making sure they are not twisted. We pin the straps down and then close the entire top edge of the center back piece. To create the shirred back, you will need 6 bits of elastic, which are about 1 cm wide, and you can use this side chart to determine the length that you need. Alternatively, you can simply measure under your bust and halve that measurement. The top row of the pattern is the seam allowance, so the second row down is where we start to insert the elastics. So the first thing we need to do is marking the channels for the elastic onto our back piece. For this, we can use the pattern as guidance as long as we take the seam allowance into account. We top stitch 11 rows of stitching through the outer and lining fabric, which should leave us with this sort of quilted back piece. We can then start feeding the elastic through the channels. For this, I'm using a safety pin and simply push the pin with the elastic through the channel until the other end of the elastic is flush with the edge of the fabric. Before we continue from here, we need to pin this end of the elastic down, and just to be safe, I would recommend using 2 pins. We can then slide through to the other side and pin this end down as well. We repeat this for the remaining 5 pieces of elastic, but we skip a channel each time. Once we have fed all the elastics through, we need to secure the elastics on the sides by stitching along the side of the back piece. Before we continue, we need to make sure that the straps are straight, which might mean that we have to flip the back piece around. We can then close the side seams of the top by folding the front piece over the back piece with the right sides facing. We are basically encasing the back piece with the front piece. This then needs to be sewn shut, and when we turn the top right sides out, we have no raw edges showing and a nice and clean seam. The last thing to do to finish the top is hemming the bottom. I would recommend simply folding the raw edges inside the top and then top stitching all around the top. For this, it is quite important that you have only sewn up to the seam allowance point of the side seams, as it will be easier to fold these inside when they are not fully shut. The top is then finished and should look like this. If you are sewing the lace up back with loops instead of eyelets, you will need to cut small rectangles of about 6 by 4 centimeters, and you will need 8 of them. These then need to be folded in half and sewn right sides together. I would recommend to cut the excess fabric, and then they can be folded right sides out. For extra sturdiness, I would recommend to top stitch the loops. These loops then need to be attached to the top by first folding them in half and then pinning them to one side of the back and top stitching it down. Once they are secure, we need to fold the other side of the top over and close that seam by sewing along the edge. After that, we need to clip the corner of the seam allowance and turn the top right sides out. Lastly, we need to close the bottom edge of the top by folding the raw edges inside the top and top stitching along the entire bottom edge. With that, all of the raw edges are enclosed, and the very last thing to do now is to feed the ribbon through the loops, and then the top is finished. And here is the final outcome. I really love this top so much, especially because of the bust piece, which just creates such a nice shape. We have seen corset tops literally everywhere, and I just really wanted to create one that is a little more wearable in everyday life, which I feel is exactly what the shirred bag provides. I really like it and I hope you do too. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments, and other than that, thank you so much for watching.